Hey there, how's it going? Hey, thank you all for tuning in for another video. I trust that you're very glad to see me, as I am very glad to see you. And before we proceed and delve into the content of this video, I just wanted to say a huge thanks to all of you who have been active in the comment section. I have thoroughly enjoyed the dialogues, the conversations, and the questions that have been added. And I just want to once again invite those of you who have not been active in the comment section, if you're watching this video, and if at any point you wish to say something, to ask a question, to just, spread your opinion or thoughts on an idea, I want this to be an environment, an environment in which we can all openly engage in really productive, enriching, meaningful discussions, and everybody is valued. And there's nothing that you can say that is just going to be, mocked and ridiculed here. So unless you say something like ridiculous, outlandish, obscure, right? But anyways, I don't want to spend too much time on that. Just putting that on the table. Anyways, we're going to be talking about the history of Western philosophy today, and namely this book, The History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. So, before we actually talk about the history of Western philosophy, I think that it is essential to talk about philosophy itself. So, right, it doesn't really make much sense to talk about the history of something if you don't even understand what something is. So, yeah, let's go ahead and establish that. So, what is philosophy exactly? There are many definitions and many characterizations or summaries of philosophy that, in some way or another, attempt to capture what we mean by the word philosophy. I have a personal definition of it, and I think that a lot of people will agree with my definition, and that is philosophy is the pursuit of truth. Very simple. Now, here's the thing about philosophy. We are all obliged to think upon philosophical things. So, in some sense, every single person living, every conscious being, is a philosopher. Okay? So, you may be thinking, like, how is this so? Well, I'll put it to you this way. We all ask questions such as, but not limited to, questions such as this. What is being? What is knowing? What is the nature of existence? Who is God? What is God like? Is there an objective moral standard? If so, what is the justification for it? How do we organize society? What political theory can maximize the welfare of all people and ensure the optimal outcomes for people interacting in a civilization? Like, all of these questions, these topics that we engage in and think upon almost on a day-to-day basis, these philosophical questions that we wrestle with, they are all the task and what philosophy, the study that is, of philosophy is concerned with. Okay? So, I think the biggest mistake that most of us make, including myself at one point, I have long since forsaken this approach, but most of us make the mistake of studying philosophy with the intention of answering those aforementioned questions. In other words, we see the value of philosophy as being and affording us answers, and that is a mistake. Don't do it, right? Because basically, what philosophy boils down to is reasoning, opinions, and arguments, and the justification for all those things, most of which are almost always difficult to understand, obscure, and sometimes even riddled with fallacies. Okay? In other words, philosophy is basically, it boils down to what you think and ultimately what you accept. Okay? So, needless to say, there's a high degree of subjectivism, I guess you could say. So you may be thinking at this point, like, if the goal of philosophy is not to actually answer any of these questions, then obviously it's not productive, right? No, that is not true. The value of studying philosophy is not in the answers that it provides. It is in what it trains us to do, and that is think. Okay? There is not another discipline that can prepare you to think as deeply, as complexly, as analytically as philosophy. And it is precisely that reason why I think it is essential we all understand it and make a point to understand its history, right? Not just understand, philosophical questions in themselves, but also understand the context of those questions and those ideas through the lens of history, okay? And that is what this book is helping us, what this book is helping us to do, okay? So, I'll say one last thing about philosophy and then we can actually delve into it, right? So, I think that it is no remarkable feat to have a degree of originality in philosophy. Like, what I mean by that is a lot of people will be ambitious and think that, I'm going to study philosophy and do something that has never been done. I'm going to create a theory that's never been created, or I'm going to write about something that's never been written about, or make an argument that's never been made. And that's cool and all, but what's really valuable is, do you understand what a philosopher such as Plato was saying, or a philosopher such as Spinoza or Hegel or Kant? Like, the fact that you could understand or articulate with reasonable certainty the questions that they asked, the way they framed them, and the answers that they provided to those questions, if you could do that, that in itself is not only impressive, but incredibly useful. Because if you're able to do that, that demonstrates that you have considered deeply the single most important questions of life, of existing. Okay? So, anyways, yeah. I would say treat philosophy that way. I think that is the proper way to treat it. So, anyways, I don't want to dwell on that too much longer. Let's go ahead and talk about this work itself. But before we do, we need to actually talk a little bit about the author, Bertrand Russell. So, who is Bertrand Russell? Or who was Bertrand Russell, rather? Bertrand Russell was a 20th century English philosopher, most notably remembered for his work in mathematics and logical analysis. He was also a staunch atheist and even wrote a work in which he severely criticized Christianity, titled Why I Am Not a Christian. So, needless to say, this was a pretty heavily opinionated fellow, but he was also quite intelligent, and he displayed that remarkably well in his writing of this book. Now, I'm not an expert in Bertrand Russell or his philosophy. If you wish to learn more about him, I would highly recommend that you Google him, or engage in some research in your personal time. Even read some of his work. I certainly intend to in the future. So, happy reading, happy research with him. Okay. Moving into the book itself. I said, I think in my first book review that I ever did, that I don't want to actually do a book review. All right. I want to really just provide a sort of commentary or opinions and thoughts on the books that I read. Okay. So, I will provide a brief overview of this book. Excuse me. I will provide a brief overview of this book, just for the sake of providing some background information on it. So I guess we can delve right into that. So, the history of Western philosophy. It is worthy to note that there are several books written on this exact same subject. This just so happens to be the first and only one that I've ever read personally. And so, needless to say, my knowledge of this subject, the history of Western philosophy, is limited to the knowledge that I've absorbed from reading this book. Okay, so what did I figure out about reading this book? Well, first off, the structure of this book, basically, you're taken through a timeline, right, that begins in the ancient realm of philosophy. The ancient era of philosophy, and leads all the way up to the modern era. And so essentially what Bertrand does is he introduces thinkers beginning with the Greeks, right? And then he works himself into the medieval era, or the era of Catholic philosophy, and then the modern era of philosophy. So this book is actually split into those three parts, right? Ancient philosophy, medieval philosophy or Catholic philosophy, and modern philosophy. Okay, so I like to use the word meet. We meet several thinkers, several philosophers. We discuss their ideas and we discuss the eras in which they lived. Okay, and just to name a few, just so you kind of have an idea. Some of these you may be familiar with. we're starting in ancient philosophy with the Greeks, some of the pre-Socratics, like Heraclitus, Anaximander, Parmenides, Pythagoras, and then going further down the timeline, we have Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, of course. And then after them, you have the Epicureans and the Stoics. And working your way into the medieval Catholic era, you have some of the Christian philosophers like St. Augustine, St. Anselm, and Thomas Aquinas. Into the Renaissance, which bleeds into the era of modern philosophy, and then the scientific revolution. You have what are, I think, some of the most recognizable names in philosophy, some of the heavy hitters, like, say, Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, Locke, Hegel, Kant, and Schopenhauer, like these really big names that most of us are probably familiar with, right? So, anyways, yeah, so we're taking in, we discuss all of these different thinkers, and we discuss the eras in which they live. And so one of the biggest challenges about reading this book is you're not only learning about philosophy in itself or the ideas in themselves, you're also learning in conjunction with that history. So it's very challenging work, okay? The central theme of this work is that there is a reciprocal nature between history and philosophy. And this is something that Bertrand kind of discusses in his introduction of this book. And what's meant by that reciprocal nature between history and philosophy is that there's this notion that the era in which a thinker lives influences the ideas that they have. But also, the ideas that a thinker can have will influence the era in which they live, and also the trajectory of history, excuse me, and hence the reciprocal nature of history and philosophy. So they sort of like trade off of each other, right? They influence each other, and it's really a beautiful relationship, and quite fascinating to think about, right? Like, who knows? You could be the next great philosopher to influence the the time in which we live in the subsequent trajectory of history. But yeah, anyways, understanding that really provides you a great perspective or scope on, I guess, on this subject, because otherwise all you're left with is a sort of static understanding of this is what happened, these are the ideas, yada, 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 yada. If you actually see it as there's a reciprocal nature between history and philosophy, you understand that there is like a sort of almost cause and effect, right, to what we have observed and what has led us up to this point, okay? So, I guess another one of the details that kind of leads into this idea is that the reason I recommend this book so highly, and not just this book, but just, the study of the history of Western philosophy, is because I think modern Westerners take for granted much of the ideas and beliefs that we have about virtually everything, really the knowledge that we have about everything. We stand upon the shoulders of giants. And I kind of said it at the beginning, or I kind of alluded to it at the beginning of this video, that, we all wrestle with philosophical questions, right? But what I did not really mention is that most of these philosophical questions, or actually all of these philosophical questions, have been wrestled with by people of times past. And so really the value of reading and understanding a history of Western philosophy is that you can kind of expedite the process of your wrestling with those philosophical questions, because you don't have to do it yourself. You can reference what somebody has already done. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So, and you can also, there's that, and then you can also understand where a lot of your beliefs and your ideas come from, not only personally, but in the society or civilization in which you live. If you're a Westerner, obviously, that's a pretty linear relationship, or it should seem like a pretty linear path of putting two and two together, right? So, yeah, I think it's just learning this subject and learning it well and understanding how to view it is, I think, just immensely beneficial to your understanding of yourself, your society, our civilization, our time, and again, the most pressing questions of life, those that philosophy concerns itself with. There's something else that I must mention about this book too, and that is Bertrand Russell's bias. So I said earlier in this video that he is a heavily opinionated fellow, or was a heavily opinionated fellow, and that is showcased prominently in his writing style. Now, he is a captivating and engaging writer, but you have to understand something. Bertrand Russell was a philosopher in his own right, and so when you're reading this book, it is not a static overview of the history of Western philosophy. Like, it's not really rigid and, detached. No, he's writing this almost like a critic. Like, he's presenting the material, and so in that sense, like, the integrity or credibility of the work is not compromised. Some people may have qualms with the bias. Personally, I don't think it's all that big a deal. If you have the appropriate level of intellectual maturity, you can easily sift through his bias and see the content for what it is, okay? So anyways, he's writing this work, and he is presenting it in such a way that is, of course, accurate and true. Now, you may have some qualms with the amount of detail that he provides on certain thinkers or certain eras or certain subjects or topics, okay? That, I will say, is probably a serious qualm, because he does obviously favor some philosophers and some ideas and some concepts to others, right? And he just outright says and discredits some thinkers. But yeah, that aside, it's just one of those things to be mindful of as you read this work. Don't let it be off-putting to you. I think it adds a layer of flavor or perspective that is really lacking in many works of this genre, or of this, of this type, nonfiction, historical works of, I can't say philosophy because this is the only history of philosophy that I've ever read, but if you're thinking about history, it's not like a typical static overview that you would, read maybe in some other subject of, regarding something else's history, okay? So, one last thing I'll mention about this book, and then I'll hush, is that this book is incredibly dense. So, I don't know if you can tell, this is a really hefty work. The reason I mention that is because it's really important to understand, if you're going to read this book, it's going to be a serious task, okay? So, excuse me. You're going to have, personally, I spent months reading this book and meticulously studying it. I went through with a pencil, highlighting, underlining, and making notes, and really engaging with the work as though I were engaging in an active dialogue or an active conversation. Now, obviously, all these thinkers are long gone, right? But we can treat their work, and we can treat the way it's presented, at least through the perspective of Bertrand Russell in this book, we can treat it as though we're having a conversation in real time, and hence train ourselves to do that thing which is essential, which I think extracts the most value out of philosophy, which is thinking, training ourselves to think, okay? Not finding answers, but training ourselves to think, right? So that's the value, right? So, this is not going to be a book that you want to rush through. It's not going to be a book that you read in a weekend or even in the matter of just a few weeks. Like, this is a book that you really need to take your time with. And I would highly recommend that you supplement with some other material, right? Like, it'll do you a lot of good if you have at least some background about some of the history, some of the vocabulary that's being used, the ideas and philosophies that are introduced, and the thinkers themselves. Just, as you're reading this book, if you get lost or confused, do not be afraid to take a moment to take a step back and be like, whoa, I need to Google something, or whoa, I need to pull out an encyclopedia or a dictionary, or I did this quite frequently. I would go on YouTube or Google and just like search something that didn't make sense to me and see if somebody else could explain it well. At times, Bertrand Russell seems a bit unintelligible. And I will attribute that to the fact that he is talking about philosophy, which in itself is abstract and often unintelligible. So, yeah, that's pretty much all of my my thoughts on the book. within a reasonable time frame. I didn't want to make this video super long, but yeah, if you have any thoughts, any opinions, any questions, please leave them down in the comment section below. If you like this content, go ahead and leave a like, subscribe. I'm trying to get in the habit of making more videos like this. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope that I can make these videos more professionally and at a higher quality going forward. I intend to get a better camera soon, so yeah. I know the video quality is crap and the audio is crap, so thank you all for being loyal and for subscribing and for supporting me. I really appreciate it. Anyways, take care, goodbye, and I will talk to you again soon.